promise not quite close. Who knows what Lent is? Who's brave enough to talk to me about it? Go for it, Mark. Amen. Okay, so 40 days, Christ was in the wilderness. It is walking with Christ for 40 days before Lent, from Ash Wednesday to Easter, right? And we traditionally give something up. How many of you fast all 40 days? Probably not. No? What do you give up for 40 days? Maybe some kind of food, maybe chocolate, maybe soda? She might. She can share. You gave up TV for 40 days? Oh my goodness, that's brave. That is awesome. Okay, you guys could give up TV for 40 days. This is what you could do. Okay, I'm inviting you to this journey. We often don't think about it or talk about it. It's a time of preparing for what God has for us. It's a time of entering into a very close relationship with God, a pilgrimage with Christ, and it's allowing God to lead and direct us. I want you to think of it this way. It is intentionally giving up something physical, whether it's food, TV, you name it, you can choose. And picking up also, we forget this part, we're picking up something spiritual. Trying something new, like a time of devotion or a time of prayer or something like that. Did everybody get one of these when you came in? Nod. If not, I'm going to have somebody grab some for you. Make sure you grab one on the way out, because this is what the whole Lenten sermon series is based on, and you'll find a little charm that goes with it. You will find a little bit of an introduction. I want to just show you what this is. It is an introduction to the sermon series we're talking about in its thin places. Actually, I'm basing it on a book that I've been reading that goes along with the Celtic Christianity. It fits really well with the Silence and Solitude study that Catherine will be teaching. But this first part, it has the prayer of St. Patrick, or St. Patrick's breastplate. It's also called the Lorica, or the Deer's Cry. And I'm going to reference that. And then on the back, it gives a little bit of an understanding of the Lenten journey. And then this page here, it talks about thin places, and it gives a little bit about what today's sermon is about. So you kind of get an intro. And then questions. By the way, yes, you can. One of the things you can pick up spiritually is journaling during Lent. So just write answers to a couple questions or thoughts even during the sermon time. And then on the back, there's a prayer or a blessing that you can pray for others. So I want you to use this as an opportunity to go a little bit deeper spiritually during this season of Lent. One thing that I want you to understand about the Celtic Christianity, I think they have a better understanding of what we do in Lent as an everyday practice. Their understanding of faith is something that was created in what they would call an insular environment. In fact, it was an insular church. It was set apart from the Catholic Church and during the Dark Ages and other things going on. And so the Catholic Church developed liturgies and other pieces that were different. Celtic Christianity or faith was very all-inclusive of life. It was about praying without ceasing, an ongoing relationship with God in every moment, with every breath and every day. They could literally experience God with each breath. They could experience God in places that they would go, whether it was a hill or a valley or the trees or the woods. They would look for God. The other really cool thing, how many of you are going to the shack today? I hope. Okay, good. You know, we're going to have a huge group there. I am excited for this. I think this is going to be a very thin space. I think going to this movie is going to be very thin, and we're going to encounter God in a way that we haven't thought about it. Kind of like Mac in this movie will go to the shack, and all of a sudden he encounters God. We're going to talk about thin spaces. But something else that they find in the movie, and something else that actually is a part of Celtic understanding, is very Trinitarian. You know, we say Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. What does that look like? Who is that? Well, if you pray some of the prayers that are Celtic prayers, it is always Trinitarian. In the name of the Father, in the name of the Son, and in the name of the Holy Spirit. That is powerful. I want you to understand and know that they believe that God is present always, everywhere, in every time, in every circumstance. Okay. That gives you just a little understanding of where we're going, because I'm excited about this series. Make sure, here's the other trick, I'm going to trick you. You have to come every week during Lent to be able to get all of the cards that will put this all together, okay? That's the trick. You have to come each week to get the prayer, the blessing, and the notes that go with it. Tricky, I know. How many of you know St. Patrick? Okay, and you know more than just about the green beer, right? It's true. I mean, often we think St. Patrick with St. Patrick's Day, it's like, where can I go and get the best green beer? Or where can I go get the best appetizers that go with the green beer, right? But St. Patrick was more than that. St. Patrick, you may not know the whole story. I'm going to summarize it very quickly. He was kidnapped from England. Early on in his life, he was taken to Ireland, and he served as a slave and actually helped watch the sheep in Ireland. He escapes. He goes back to England. He gets trained and educated, becomes a priest, somebody who is following. In fact, he then goes back to Ireland because he hears God calling him. He hears Christ calling him from Ireland. He goes back to the very man who kidnapped him. He says, I want to serve you again. This time I want to serve you from God, as a servant of God. And begins to teach this good news about Jesus Christ. In 433, when Patrick is there, he's scared. He's afraid for his life. He's hunkering down, and he's praying what I would call a foxhole prayer. And actually that foxhole prayer becomes this prayer of St. Patrick's breastplate. And by the way, this is a very shortened version. If you want to find the longer version, you can Google it. I added some pieces in there, but if you take just those lines there that are highlighted as they start with Christ, those are often memorized. They're used as a way of understanding that Christ is with us always. And he's praying this foxhole prayer, and he's saying, Christ within me, Christ with me, Christ before me, Christ behind me, Christ in me, Christ beneath me, Christ above me, Christ on my right, Christ on my left, Christ when I lie down, Christ when I sit down, Christ when I arise. And then I love this, Christ in the heart of everyone who thinks of me, Christ in the mouth of everyone who speaks of me, Christ in the eye of every eye that sees me, Christ in every ear that hears me. Wow. Do you hear how that is like interwoven? Like Christ is everywhere and in everything, and he's covering and protecting and shielding. This was a shielding prayer for St. Patrick in a very difficult time, in a time that he was afraid for his life. It was a prayer of protection. I encourage you, if you're doing nothing else for Lent, pray those lines every morning when you wake up, just to get the sense or the presence that God is with you in this season of Lent. I'm going to also in this series talk a little bit more about Columba. Columba was from Ireland actually, and he was born in 521, so 150 years later, so-ish. And then he passed away in 597, but he actually got in a little bit of trouble. He actually started what they might consider a religious war. By the way, religion is not always good for each other. People tend to fight when they're in churches. Did you know that? That's sad. But there's this religious war that he essentially starts, and eventually he gets exiled. They say, get out of here. They boot him. Boy, that doesn't make you feel good as a pastor, I'm sure. But I would tell you this. He went faithfully, and he went to start another monastery, a place of worship. And so he goes to do this, but he moves just off the coast and actually moves to the edge of Scotland, but he can still see Ireland. And he realizes that, okay, I can still see Ireland. That's going to bug me. I'm not going to be able to really worship. I'm not going to be able to really lead if I'm still hanging on to that past stuff. And so he moves further north, and he establishes an abbey on the island of Iona, an island which I'll be visiting later this year, because they're still worshiping. They still meet daily. They practice a Celtic Christianity, a deep-rooted understanding of God in everything. Today we're going to talk about this sermon. This is called Thin Places. And I want to ask, what is it that you think makes a place thin? And by thin, I mean where you feel like you really encounter the presence of God. What makes a place feel like God is right there? Anybody? Go for it. Okay, so when you feel God actually in your mind, or you feel God's telling you, you should do this rather than this, helping you make good decisions, that's a place where God is right there with you. I'm going to actually agree with you on this. And we're going to get to where it's actually understanding that it's more of this kind of understanding of God than what we might think. How often I've talked to people that feel like, in fact, you guys are brave enough to worship in a school. Did you know God can show up in a school? And you go to school and you know God there too. You know, the truth is, I know a lot of people would say, I need a building. I need the stained glass windows. I need the big organ. I need this space to feel like it's holy. I need to be, actually some people would say, I need to be on the golf course to experience God. You know, anybody like that? So I know some people. I need to be in the woods. I need to be on the mountaintop, or I need to see the sunrise. I need that kind of thing to really experience God. Well, I'm not going to discount that because I believe that that is absolutely true. We can experience God in those things. But what is it really that makes a place thin? I'm going to come back to this question as we get into the end of things too. I want to point this out. It's about a divine encounter. It's about seeing God in the midst of whatever we do, not just the space or what's going on around us. In fact, we're going to talk about how in Genesis 28, which we read this morning, where Jacob meets God, where he lays down. Did you know the precursor to all of this is Jacob is running. He's fleeing from his brother. He's scared to death. He thinks he's going to die, and he's seeking God's help. And he rests for the night, and he has this vision, this dream of this Jacob's ladder, we call it. And he says, this is heaven's gate. This is the house of God. This place is, I'm encountering God here. And he calls it Bethel, which means the house of God. Wow. How many of us would love to have that kind of encounter? That place meant something to Jacob. And it delivered him because God promised his protection. So Bethel means God, meeting God in the house of God. In Genesis 32, Jacob gets lucky enough, he meets God again. You remember the story of Jacob wrestling this man late at night and through the whole night, and it gets to be early in the morning, and the man says, let me go. He says, no. He puts his hip out. Okay, you got to love this. You encounter God, and God's going to leave an impression. In this particular case, God puts his hip out in such a way that for the rest of Jacob's life, he's walking around with a hitch in his hip. I mean, he couldn't forget it because every time he took a step, he'd remember, oh yeah, God did that. The other thing that God did in that space, after Jacob said, I won't let go unless you bless me. He said, your name from now on shall not be Jacob, but it shall be Israel. You guys know that this is where Jacob's name changed, right? He says, your name from now on shall be Israel. Okay? Here's the interesting part. Did you know that for the next 3 chapters, Jacob still goes by Jacob? Jacob doesn't change his name. Have you ever encountered God in a thin space where it's like you get smacked upside the head because God is trying to tell you something very important? I mean, so hard that you're still walking around with a hitch, that every day and every step you know that God impacted you in that moment and in that space, told you that your life was going to be changed from that moment on, and you go around the same as it was the day before. You wake up and you go to the same pattern of behavior. You go back to that temptation. You go back to that struggle. You go back to that mistake rather than saying, God said from now on, this point, my life is going to be changed. How many of us do that? I think I'm going to call Jacob thick-headed. He didn't get it. In fact, if you read Scripture, you find out Jacob was really thick-headed, so I'm not off on this. But in this case, I mean, he didn't even take the name change. Chapter 35 in Genesis, you encounter Jacob again. He's scared to death because his sons had gone out and done something that was going to bring all of the nations around him down upon them. He was sure that he was going to die, that they were going to come and kill all of his family. And so he's crying out to God. He says to his kids, "What have you done?" And God says, "Go back to Bethel. If you're not going to believe me in this other place where you wrestled me," I forgot to mention, he called that Peniel, which means meeting God face to face. So he has a house of God and the place where he met God face to face. Thin places. God says, "Go back to Bethel. Go back to where you first encountered me in this dream of this ladder." So he goes back, and now he's a blessed person. He first went there empty-handed. Now he goes back with his flocks and his sheep and his wives and his children and all that he's been blessed with. And he goes to this place, and he begins to worship again. And God says, "Hey, I told you something. I gave you a promise before." It says, "From now on, I'm going to remind you." He says, "Your name is Israel." How many times do we have to encounter God in a thin space? How many times does God have to hit us upside the head for us to realize, oh, God just made something happen in my life. God did something good. God made me a new person. The truth is, God meets us in these thin places. He changes our circumstances. He hits us in the hip in a way that we can't go around life without recognizing his presence with every breath and every step and every day. And yet, we wake up in thick places. Maybe I should ask the question, what makes it feel like God is near to us? Some of you, in fact, one of the questions in there is, what are some places that feel thin to you? And where have you gone and that feel thin? But what is it that makes us encounter God? Let me just break down some New Testament passages for you a second. Actually, this one's still old even. How many of you know the phrase at Advent that says, Emmanuel, God, see, you guys know this. Emmanuel, God with us. God is with us. I mean, that means that God set aside heaven, came down, put on human flesh, walked among us. In fact, Jesus, even when he left, said, "I will never leave you, forsake you. I'll be with you always to the very end of the age." He kind of took away the barrier. In fact, we set up the barrier, and God's since then been working at taking down the barrier. In Romans chapter 1, we find that it tells us that God's invisible qualities are absolutely visible all the time. His eternal powers, his divine nature are clearly seen in all of creation. God's not trying to hide from us. God's not behind some rock or some stone. He's not up there in the stars somewhere. He's trying to be present right here, right now. Actually, think about this. We're coming up on Good Friday and Easter. What happened when Jesus died on the cross? In the temple. In the temple, like where people would come to worship, and there was this veil thing. What happened to that? It was torn. The space that was considered the Holy of Holies, the place where God was and the place where people couldn't enter, was torn because God was saying, there is no more barrier between you and I. It's gone. I've broken it. You see, God made that space thin. God has done everything to get close to us. God desires residence in our life. He doesn't want any barriers. So now I'm going to turn the whole conversation to thick places. How many of you have thick places in your life? That feels more normal, doesn't it? You wake up, you look at your clock, you pull out your calendar. What have I got to do today? How much can I get done? Oh, I've got to achieve that. And I forgot to call that person and make sure that gets done. Oh yeah, and this person needs that. Or maybe it's just thick when you think of, I really do not have any desire to go to work today. Or it might be thick in family relationships or people that you meet and you're just don't even want to encounter somebody, and that just feels like this burden or this brokenness or this hurt in your life, and it feels thick. Am I right? Do you know what I'm talking about? There's a difference between a space or a place or a relationship that feels thick versus something that feels thin. A place that feels holy. A place that feels like the very Spirit of God is as close as your own breath. Something that is proceeding out and flowing in. Something that is there present, flowing through you. Maybe it's consumerism. Maybe it's pride. Whatever it is for you, whatever that thick space is, I want you to think about Columba. Remember I said he moved from Ireland, he was exiled from Ireland to start a monastery that's still worshiping. But the first place that he went to, he said, I'm still too close. He could see in the distance, he could still see his beloved Ireland and the memory of the pain, the memory of all of that hurt, and he knew that he would not be able to move on. The thickness of his past was holding on to him. So he decided to move further so it was that past, that history was out of sight, and he could start fresh. What are your thick places? How do you move beyond those barriers to find your thin space? The truth of thin places is this, and a Celtic understanding of thin places is this, that we should not expect to experience God on a mountaintop or in an abbey if we cannot experience God in our kitchen. God's present with us all the time, everywhere, dwelling in us. For space to be thin, we don't have to go someplace holy. We don't have to go someplace that feels or looks or sounds right. We just, first of all, have to sit in the presence and realize God's there. Before we can expect a place to be holy or anointed or thin, we first of all have to look at the internal landscape of our soul to see if we have made it thin, or if we've made the ground fertile, or if we have nurtured a healthy relationship with God. This Lent, I'm asking you, I'm challenging, in fact, to look at your own personal life. I'm challenging you to look at the landscape of your soul and see, is it thin? Are you allowing the Spirit, the presence of God to fill you, to move in you, to transform you, to meet you face to face? These places in the Bible, I could go through and list a bunch where God meets people face to face, or in the midst of their struggle, the midst of their hurt, the midst of their fear, pain. But we have to make ourselves available. The concept of a thin space is to understand that there's barely a film between us and the holy. Celtic experience would say that every day, not just Lent, but every day should be a day of finding a thin space in our life. But for this Lent, I hope you don't just walk through it and expect to show up on Saturday or Sunday and expect, oh, that's the only place I'm going to meet God this week. I hope instead that you seek every day and with every breath, with every step, a hitch in your step, that you might remember that God is close. At least do me one favor. Take time to pray. Take off this little token that's on there and carry it in your pocket. Pull it out and pray. To be reminded that Christ is there. Do something this Lent to make the space between you and God thin. Would you pray with me?